I want to say thank you to all the people who are attending today's little class on options basics. Um, we're going to just be going over what options are and why we trade them, and a little bit of details um, having to do with options trading in its entirety as a beginner. And then after the presentation, if you guys are interested, I do have Robinhood Legend open afterwards, and we can take a look at the options chain and kind of I'll do a kind of a Q&A at the end where we can take a look at options on the chain um, if you have any questions. So, without further ado, I'm going to get right into it. Disclaimer and disclosure: options trading entails significant risk, and it's not appropriate for everyone. I'll just put this out there. What we do in this Discord is that we want to educate as many people who are interested in trading and investing as possible. But with that said, this presentation is for educational purposes only, and everything that's presented in the Discord and on this presentation is not financial advice. So that's my disclaimer for you guys. So we must ask ourselves, what are options? I'm sure you've heard of, you've heard of stocks, you've heard of ETFs, but maybe you haven't heard of what an option is. Well, options, they're contracts. They give the buyer the right, but not the obligation to purchase 100 shares of an underlying stock. So if I want to go out and buy an option, I would pick a stock first, so say like Amazon. And if I go to buy an option contract on Amazon, that contract is saying I can either buy or sell the stock at a predetermined price at a predetermined date. By buying the option, you're saying that you want to purchase or sell at that future date at a predetermined price, which we call the strike price. An underlying is just a term used for any stock, ETF, or index, and that's what the contract is basing its basically what the option is attaching itself to. It's the underlying. So if I want to trade an option, I would choose either a stock, ETF, or index. An example of that would be like Amazon stock, or you could trade options on QQQ, which is an ETF, or you could trade SPX, which is index. Holders of options may opt into exercising that option, and what exercising is converting your options contract into those actual shares. So the options contract gives you the right to buy or sell those 100 shares, and at the time of expiration for your contract, you may want to actually acquire those shares with your contract. I would say most people who trade options in general don't exercise, so this is not something that you would have to be too concerned about overall. All right, so now we're on the why do we trade options? Well, options, they're a form of leverage. They are a derivative asset, so the option itself can control 100 shares of the underlying stock. So by buying one options contract for Amazon, I'm basically given the ability to trade the value of 100 shares with just one contract. So basically, when Amazon goes up $1, because I am controlling 100 shares with that contract, it will go up $100. That's the basics behind it. The reason why many people trade options contracts is because of leverage, which gives people the ability to amplify their gains, but also capital requirements. You can purchase options contracts for far, far less than purchasing the stock outright. So if you wanted to buy that Amazon contract for $500, that's way better than having to spend, $240 times 100 shares, right, to control the underlying stock. So here are some trade-offs, though. Time. Time being one of the greatest enemies to any options buyer. Options have an expiration where their value decreases every single day until they eventually hit zero, or you're in the money and you convert your options contract into shares. Obviously, you don't necessarily want to hold your contract as long, that long to make it go to zero. But that time component is what makes options trading so difficult. And that's what makes it so much more difficult than buying stock. Because essentially, if you're buying just stock, that stock price movement could go against you. And you can just hold the stock for as long as you want for it to recover. Another trade-off is that leverage. Again, because it is a derivative asset, the contract itself is leveraged, and that can work for you and against you. So many beginners will find themselves taking too much risk relative to their portfolio because they're not fully understanding the leverage that's involved in an options contract. Are there any questions about this part, about the why people trade options or why you would want to get into it? I'll take just a minute or two. If there's anything in the chat, you can type it right now. If not, I will move forward. All right, so it doesn't look like any. Oh, maybe one question. Does it have to be short term? So options contracts, yeah, that's a great question. So options contracts can be any length of time that you want. It could be today, it could be 2 years from now. Your options contract, in terms of expiration or the date that it supposedly will be zero, can be any date in the future. So it doesn't have to be short term, but I will go into why most traders will trade short term options. And there's a slide on it. Don't worry. We'll come back to it. So here are the two types of options that are available to us as traders. We have the call option. A call option is a contract that allows the holder, the buyer, which is you, to buy 100 shares at the strike price up to the defined expiration date. And this is known as a long call, which is a bullish position. So if you went to your Robinhood or if you went to whatever brokerage account you're using and you were to buy a call, you're going to be bullish on whatever stock that you're buying that call for. And then on the other side, we have put options. A put option is a contract that allows the holder to sell 100 shares at the strike price up to the defined expiration date. This is known as a long put, which is bearish. Most people will buy puts because they think a stock will go down. Other times, people will buy puts because they own a stock that they may want to offload at some point in the future if the stock begins to tumble quite a bit. But that's, those mechanics are a little bit more different than our basics here. So you buy calls if you think a stock goes up, and you buy puts if you think a stock is going to go down. So those are just the general basics for these two types of options. And that's what these options are at its core. So we have a little bit of options terminology that I'm going to go over here. We have ITM, which stands for in the money. And in the money options are those that have intrinsic value, meaning that when their strike is beyond the underlying price, that contract itself has value, wherein that the options contract is controlling 100 shares, and the difference between the strike price and underlying gives you a certain amount of value. So like if Amazon's at $250 and you're in the money by $2, then your contract by default will have some kind of value because you can actually exercise that contract for those shares. So if you bought a call at 248 and Amazon's at 250, then you could theoretically exercise that call and get Amazon shares to you at 240 versus 250. So that's what intrinsic value is. Think of it like if you're in the money, then you have intrinsic value. Calls with strikes below where the underlying is currently trading puts your call in the money, and then puts with strikes above where the underlying is trading also puts you in the money. What I mean by this is that if you're betting a stock goes down, and say if we were to buy Robinhood puts at 100 strike, and right now Robinhood's closing in on 95, then that would be considered in the money because the underlying price is $5 under where the strike price is for your put. At the money ATM stands for at the money, and these are just the strikes closest to where the underlying price is currently. Out of the money is options that have no intrinsic value, meaning that you wouldn't be able to exercise them, so they don't really have any value to the buyer at the time that you own them. Calls with strikes above where the underlying price is currently trading is considered out of the money, and puts with strikes below where the underlying is currently trading is considered out of the money as well. And we can go over on Robinhood on the options chain to kind of get a visual idea of what this looks like, because maybe the words can be a little complicated to understand. So essentially, when you're buying options, you want to buy an option that increases in value, and the only way that this happens is if the stock moves in the direction that you want. So if you are currently out of the money, you want your option to go into the money or at the money to gain value. Options pricing factors. So an options premium will vary based on where they are relative to the underlying price. Out of the money options, they'll have lower premiums because there's no actual intrinsic value to them, meaning that you can't exercise them for any value. And at the money options have the most time value and have a higher chance of gaining intrinsic value, meaning if you bought an option at the money or right next to what the current price is, you have a decent chance of it going in the money because it is so close. It doesn't guarantee that you'll make any money. It just gives you decently higher odds that the price will move in your direction to gain intrinsic value. In the money options are higher premium, but they offer intrinsic value right away. And more often than not, if you are a beginner, you probably want to be trading options at the money or in the money because they don't decay as fast and they move closer to what the underlying stock is doing in terms of price movement. And I'll explain why that is the case in a bit. For the other component of premium in an option is the time value. The further out you go in time, the more your option will cost because options over time decay in value. And by giving yourself more time, you are buying that time. So longer dated options decay at a slower rate because they're further out from your date of expiration. So they offer an advantage. They offer the advantage of giving you time to allow your options play to play out. Why some people don't go as far out in time is simply because of cost, or you think the move for the underlying stock will happen much faster than your predetermined strike price or date, the expiration date. So when you're looking at options pricing, one, it has to do with where it is, if it's in the money, at the money, or out of the money. And the second is how much time are you buying for this option to play out? Any questions about the two slides I just presented here? All right, if not, I'm going to move on. All right, so we just went over what options are, why we trade them, where their value comes from, and now we're going to talk about what gives their options pricing changes. There's components to it, and those are called options Greeks. And more often than not, beginners will end up buying options without understanding anything about the Greeks. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it really doesn't work out at all. It's important to understand how your options pricing will change when you go to buy it. If you don't know how much your option could be potentially worth if the stock moves with you, then that might not be an option that I would take, because then you can't have any real form of predictability. So the options Greeks, from basically most important to least important, but all of them are fairly important. We have delta, which helps determine how much an option may move if the underlying stock moves by $1. It can also be used as a gauge to see how likely your option will remain in the money at expiration, but it's not a sure thing. It basically can give you an upfront gauge of where you think your option can go. What I mean by this for delta is if Amazon goes up $1, or maybe this will be a good exercise for chat. Hopefully you guys are able to type in chat here. But if Amazon goes up $1 and my delta is 0.5, how much is that option going to move, right? Anyone want to take a guess in chat how much the option would move if it moved $1, but my delta is 0.5? There you go. All right, we got a right answer. It'll go up 50 cents. And all of the denomination for the money that we're talking about here is multiplied by 100. So that would be, $50. So when you look at when you're looking at delta, that kind of gives you an idea, right? If the stock is moving with or against you, how much your options price will move with every $1 in the underlying movement. The second component that is important to know is gamma, which is how much the delta might move with every dollar move in the underlying. So if I have a gamma of say 0.05 and my option and my underlying stock goes up $1, your delta would be at 0.55, right? And basically the more at the money your option gets, the more accelerating delta you get. As your option becomes closer in the money, or it becomes closer to the money and into the money, your delta goes higher, meaning the further the stock is moving past your strike, the higher delta you have, meaning you'll make more money quicker. Is higher delta more risky? Not necessarily. Say like if you're in the money and the stock moves against you, right? Then yes, you would be losing money faster. Can delta ever be higher than 1? So no, delta can never be higher than 1. 1 would just be like owning 100 shares, which is basically like a very deep in the money option. So if you were to buy a LEAP contract, which is an option contract that expires 1 year from now or more, you might go really deep in the money and buy, an options contract that is like basically all the way in the money. Will you cover gamma flips, or maybe not this course? I won't cover gamma flips on this course now. It's a little bit more advanced stuff. Maybe on a more advanced class. Yeah. So yeah, delta can never be more than 1. It ranges anywhere from 0 to 1. And that's just the rate at which your options contract pricing will change for every $1 move in the underlying. All right. Now the third one here, theta, is every options buyer's worst nightmare, and it's even mine sometimes. Theta helps you measure how much value an option might lose for each day that passes. As I've said before, options contracts have a limited lifespan. It's from now until your expiration date, and in between that is the time decay. And every day you hold that option, it will lose value. That is a given. This never changes, really. From the time that you buy the option to its expiration, your option will always lose value if it's out of the money. So it's very important to understand, am I buying an option that's too short dated? Because if you are buying an option that is too short dated, your theta will be a massive portion of the premium that you pay for that option. And how this works against us is if we buy a call option for a stock because we think the stock will go up, well, the theta of that option basically takes away the value of that option every day. And every day that the stock doesn't move in our favor, we're going to start losing money, which, is not ideal, right? So as an options buyer, you want to place the options trade that you think will pan out in the quickest amount of time. You can mitigate this by going further out in time, as the total theta decay on your option is a lower percentage of the option's price. All right. Any questions about theta? Because this one it could have like a whole slide on its own because, you know, the decay of your option is not a straight line. You know, you're not losing just a flat 5 cents a day. It does change relative to how much time you have left, and it does get steeper as you get closer to expiration. So longer expiration date is safer. Yes. From an options buyer's perspective, if you go out in time, right, far enough, your option may hit profitability, you know, within that time frame. Basically when you buy the option, you're saying, well, okay, if I think the stock is going to move in 30 days, but I'm going to give myself 60 days just in case, right? Then you're you're buying yourself more time insurance in that way. How close to expiration is too risky? So technically, like very mechanically speaking, any option that is less than 30 to 45 days, any option that's less than 30 days is technically at risk of having pretty high theta decay. And the reason for that is because the theta decay between 30 days and 0 days ramps quickly in an exponentially. So if you're buying options, ideally you would want to buy options that are further out than 30 days, but you know, it's not like not everyone can afford those kinds of options. And even if you do go out further out in time, it may not save you anyway, right? The option may just move against you entirely. And at that point, you would just have to close for a loss and not pray that time helps you in that regard. That's why I don't typically trade anything that short dated unless it's a short option, which is something completely different and not a basic strategy. But like if you're trading zero date to expiration, so like ones that expire on the day that you wake up, then you're going to have a hard time making money unless the move, you know, is in your favor pretty quickly, and you would see that throughout the day. If you don't reach the target, how much at risk are you lose loss wise? So options contracts, the most amount of money that you can lose buying an option contract is how much you paid upfront in premium for that options contract. So if I think Amazon's going to go up and I buy a call option for $5, which is $500 out of pocket, then that is the most risk that I'm taking, right? If Amazon doesn't move in my favor at all and my option expires worthless, then my max risk will be $500 for that trade. So it has a finite amount of loss when you are buying options. All right. So I'm going to move on just to the next two. We have Vega, which helps you understand how sensitive an option might be to large price swings in the underlying stock. And this is related to implied volatility, or better known as IV. And basically, if you have an options contract that has a high Vega or a high implied volatility, your options contract will be more expensive. And the reason for that is because the options contract is basically pricing where the stock might move, right? You're buying an option. You're buying an option for the sole purpose of thinking you think a stock might move a certain amount by a certain time, and the options contract itself is constantly trying to price in what the move would be, right? And that changes from time to time. Um, and in more depth in other classes, I talk about volatility expansion and regression and how that can help you as an options buyer or seller. But that's a little bit too much for this class. Um, and then lastly, we have Rho, which helps you simulate the effect of interest rates on an option. This one's not as impactful as the first four, but it does change the options contract sometimes. But for most options traders, it can be relatively ignored. Any questions about options Greeks before I move on? If not, I will move on to the next slide. Oh, maybe a question being typed. To be clear, these Greeks are always changing while stock prices change. That is correct. So, all of these Greeks are constantly adjusting based on where the underlying price is relative to your options contract, right? If your option is in the money, you'll have higher delta versus an option that is out of the money. And your option going from out of the money into the money will change all of these Greeks. So if your option is out of the money and it goes into the money, your delta will be higher, your gamma will be higher, your theta will most likely stay about the same, right? Because your options contract has either in the money or intrinsic value or time value on it, right? Every options contract has a time component as a portion of the premium, and that will always burn off over time, right? Say I'm buying an option and a portion of the premium that I pay is $100 for that option. Well, that $100 is going to burn away because of theta, right? So you're looking at how much um, how much value is your option gaining between the time that you buy it versus when you sell it with that decay, right? Your option could decay $100 because of the theta decay, right? But if you have the stock move in your favor enough, then you may not have to worry about that component, essentially, because the options premium would increase as it goes in your favor. Ideally, every out of the money option that you buy goes in the money and deep in the money, and that's it. But world's not a perfect place, so almost never happens like that. Not perfectly, at least. All right, next slide. All right, so to get started, I'm sure most of the people here have some kind of brokerage account already, right? But if you have a Robinhood or Webull account, they do have the ability to paper trade options. Basically, paper trading, if you don't know what that is you can take an options trade without putting any money at risk. And I 100% recommend this for any beginner, right? So then you get a feel for how an options price changes and varies with not only time, but also stock underlying change in price. Take a look at the stock options chain and get familiar with identifying on the chain which side is calls and which side is puts. And then identify for yourself on the options chain that you're looking at, which options are in the money, at the money, and out of the money. I wouldn't place an options contract trade unless I knew those very simple things, because you want to make sure that you're executing the trade that you actually want and not some random trade. Once you have an idea of what option you want to buy and how to locate it, you would add it to your watch list or paper position, and then just watch it. Become familiar with how it reacts to the underlying movement. Watch how it decays, and over time you'll become more comfortable with how to trade those options. So that's everything I had in this presentation. We can do a Robinhood exercise if you guys are interested. I do have Robinhood Legend open, and we could take a look at the options chain together. And feel free to ask questions as I go over stuff.